Hi class, Professor Seeger here. In this video, I'll be going over the major nuts and bolts formal elements of poetry, and how they imply various traditions which create subtle nuances of meaning in a poem. There's a smidge of overlap between this lecture and the Sound is Meaning lecture. This is because elements of sound are often one traditional element of many poetic forms. After this chapter, you will be familiar with the components of a poem, as well as a handful of the more important poetic traditions, especially the sonnet. This, of course, will help you understand how poets work within and without various poetic traditions. At this point in the program, if you haven't already, please remove yourself from all distractions. Make sure you have a pen and a pad of paper to take notes during this presentation. If I go too quickly, please feel free to stop and rewind as often as you need to. Bon appetit! Many folks hate poetry. So many times I hear students and even instructors sometimes say they are afraid of not getting at the true meaning of a poem, or that they are afraid their interpretation will be out and out wrong. They are overwhelmed. There are so many things to consider. Formal elements such as line, stanza, rhyme scheme, and poetic forms help show us what elements and even themes we might focus on. These are the basic building blocks and formative structures of poetry. In a large way, they determine content, tone, and style. More importantly for you, these elements will help orient you in any poem and give you some direction in your interpretation or analysis. In a very basic way, our initial approach to a poem for analysis should be scientific. If you're analyzing the cross-pollination of various flowers and you are using the procedures for examining a koala bear, you'll be wasting a lot of time. You obviously need a different set of analytical tools, otherwise you will miss a lot of important factors. Same with various types of poems. If you analyze a mostly lyrical poem with a narrative mindset, you will miss a lot of important aspects of that poem. By initially classifying poems, you save time and frustration. Do it. It only takes a second and could save you hours of head scratching. Like in fiction, understanding the formal elements and traditions that a poem follows or resists gives the reader a better understanding of how best to approach it. Try driving a semi-truck, when all your previous experience is in dealing with your automatic Honda Accord. There is quite a bit of difference. Both are vehicles, but chances are you will spend time figuring things out. You might get into a fender bender or two before you become familiar with all the subtle differences. You could save a lot of awkwardness if you learned what to expect as a truck driver. That's what truck driving school is all about. It's good to know the parts that make up a poem. First off, it's good to know the terminology so you're not saying the first part of the poem or the opening paragraph thingy. You have more authority in your reader's eyes if you talk the talk. Consider this. If you're trying to impress a mechanic, you don't call the radiator that long washboard-looking leaky thing. They're going to shake their head at you and whisper "rube" under their breath. Some might even overcharge you. Just saying. Stanzas are the little rooms that make up the house of the poem. Each stanza typically separates the poem into ideas or movements. Think paragraphs in an essay. Each one deals with the subject in a slightly different way. Sometimes, however, poets will have no stanzas. Or more confusing still, they will have stanzas of different lengths in the same poem. Or some stanzas will break mid-sentence, mid-image, or thought. This is called enjambment, and might suggest various things about the author's tone and style, as do the poems, with no stanzas whatsoever. Note: stanzas do not need to rhyme. They often do, especially in older poems, but that is not a prerequisite for a poetic stanza anymore. I don't care what the interweb says. Calling all divisions of lines the generic term stanzas is perfectly acceptable. But when a poem has varying lengths of stanzas, or you want to show off your smarts, you can get more specific. A couplet equals a couple or 2 lines. A tercet is 3 lines, and so on. The sense of line in a poem is a very personal and stylistic choice for a poet. Most poets think long and hard about how to compose their line. You can learn a lot about what a poet values by noticing their sense of line, meter, rhyme scheme, inverted syntax, enjambed lines, end-stopped lines, etc. A well-considered poetic line can either subtly slow a reader down, speed them up, or highlight double meanings and specific connections between things. Top 10 reasons to consider poetic line. Number 10. Formal or metrical reasons often determine where to stop. This is typically due to the poet following a prescribed number of poetic feet. But remember, even poets who write in meter, and not all poets do, don't follow that meter strictly. For more on meter, see my Sound is Meaning lecture. Number 9. Lines often close at the end of phrases or sentences. This is to reinforce the grammatical structures of the poem or to make it easier to understand and read logically. Number 8. Broken phrases that are anti-grammatical. This is often an effect that changes the pacing of a poem, places in words with multiple uses or interpretations, or creates a fragmentation to recreate a fragmented memory or consciousness on the speaker's part. Number 7. Many poets enjoy employing violent or dramatic line breaks that draw attention to themselves, to particular terms, sounds, or meanings. See Gwendolyn Brooks's "We Real Cool." She utilizes the line break to emphasize the group, or we, in the poem, and the absence of that we at the end of the poem. Line breaks in other poems are more subtle, drawing less attention to themselves, but no less important. Both sorts seem necessary for one another. Number 6. Lines end when they carry a certain weight or image or meaning, when that vision or sense matches the weight and shape of other lines. This might give the reader hints as to what the reader finds weightier or more significant in a poem. Number 5. Sometimes lines work to create provisional meanings to foreshadow a sentence's conclusion or to set up a tension between the line's meaning and that of the sentence or phrase once it is complete. Remember, typically this tension is short-lived and draws attention to dramatic moments in the poem. It is often a way to reinforce and draw attention to those tense moments. Number 4. Some poets use their sense of line to reinforce the repetition and variation of a phrase, set of sounds, or metrical units. Many poets will create a long list or chant by utilizing the repetition of key phrases and grammatical structures. Number 3. Rhymes and slant rhymes can be reasons for ending a line. Rhyme often affects enjambment by couching or curbing it, giving range to the movement of a sentence. However, enjambment tugs against rhyme because line tugs against sentence. You may also notice that some poets twist the syntax of a sentence for the sake of rhyme. This is another sign to look for, a place where form supersedes clarity. Why would a poet do that? Number 2. Grammatical or syntactical inversion can also be reasons to shape or end a particular line. And if this isn't done for the sake of rhyme, then what other reason would a poet invert syntax? Typically, even if the poem is inverting syntax for rhyme, there are multiple reasons for that inversion. Ask yourself what that intention might be, and more importantly, ask yourself what the effect of that inversion is on you. And the number one reason a poet chooses their sense of line: to create an imagistic, sonic, symbolic, or cognitive stress of ending and beginning words. And opening up the connotation of a phrase, or a more denotative shutting down of that phrase, might be especially important to consider at the end of this type of line. The most basic way to classify poems is to divide them into narratives and/or lyrics. Some folks might argue which category a particular poem falls into, but the truth is that most poems have qualities of both. The purpose of categorizing a poem in this way is to give direction to your focus. If you want, you could read a poem looking for the narrative qualities, and when you're done, read it again looking for the lyrical qualities, and you'll observe a lot of new interesting things. It might even be a different poem. Not literally a different poem, but, you know. Even most short lyrical poems have a narrative situation as a framework. Remember this: most good poetry analysis papers show the connections and interactions between the narrative and lyrical elements. Remember this too: when considering narrative and lyrical qualities, it is almost never all or nothing. Even the most lyrical of poems has some kind of narrative situation or framework, and even the most narrative of poems has some lyrical moments. Narratives are poems that tell a story. Usually they are longer and utilize characters, conflict, setting, narrator, or speaker of the poem, all the formal elements of fiction. Solidly narrative poems even have a plot. This does not mean that lyrical and stylistic qualities are not important in these poems. It might suggest that these elements of style and sound are subservient to the narrative qualities, however. Lyrical poems tend to be less interested in linear or logical storytelling than in making emotional, stylistic, and rhythmic connections. They tend to be short, and they tend to be fragmented and rely heavily on elements of style. When analyzing a lyric, you may need to first consider the narrative situation, who the speaker is supposed to be, not the author, and what leads them to the state depicted in the poem. Then you might consider how it creates those emotional reactions in the reader. This is where you pay close attention to clues in sound, figurative language, and traditions of any form the author is using. Each of the following types of poems has its own specific traditions, themes, and poetic movements. Consequently, understanding the type of poem can give you clues as to those themes and movements. You learn to expect them and understand their general and specific purpose. Understand, this is not an exhaustive list of poetic forms. We won't deal with epic poems in this class. They are too long, they're narrative, and most of them are centuries old. They are more than long narrative poems, however. They tend to promote the values of their specific culture, and they tend to follow the outline of the hero's journey, where a hero leaves home to gain knowledge and then returns home with this wisdom for everyone. The dramatic monologue is when the author takes on the persona or mask of another character, object, etc. The argument might be made that all poems are persona poems, but that is not very helpful, is it? The difference must be dramatic in a dramatic monologue, and typically specific. And the general sense of a dramatic monologue is that the character is on stage with a spotlight. There is sometimes a narrative situation, but often it might be implied mostly by the persona the author takes on, or the title of the poem. There are hundreds of poetic forms. Well, at least 30. We won't be dealing with too many of them in class, but it is helpful to be able to identify a couple of the more popular forms and how they came about. Often the purpose and traditions of a form help in understanding an individual poem written in that form. For example, knowing sonnets are generally about love, we can read the poem looking for the author's take on that theme and how they are resisting or embracing those traditions of that theme. Authors have a lot of different attitudes and beliefs about form. This is part of their aesthetic, or style. Usually, we get hints of this attitude through the style and tone of the poems. Do they stretch form? Do they use contrary diction to the subject matter? Do they forsake the rhyme scheme in a sonnet? This all suggests something about how the reader should take the poem. Look for these details. This poem by John Berryman is written in an open form. It is a form, but is one the author created. It has a very complex and erratic rhyme scheme. Unless you squint right, you might not even notice a rhyme scheme upon an initial read. What I have done is given you a poem on the left, and on the right I have mapped out the rhyme scheme of the poem. The way I do this is to give each word, each end word, the word at the end of the line, a letter. So heart gets an A, and since years doesn't rhyme with it, it gets a B. Then you'll notice that the next rhyme with years is in line 5, ears. That gets a B as well. This is an easy and fun way to show rhyme patterns in a poem. Typically, if you're asked to scan a rhyme scheme of a poem, you need to scan the entire poem. Listen to how the rhymes are revealed and hidden as I read this poem. Dream Song 29. There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart, so heavy, if he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless in all them time, Henry could not make good. Starts again always in Henry's ears, the little cough somewhere, an odor, a chime. And there is another thing he has in mind, like a grave Siamese face 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. Ghastly, with open eyes he attends, blind. All the bells say, too late, this is not for tears, thinking. But never did Henry, as he thought he did, end anyone, and hacks her body up, and hide the pieces where they may be found. He knows, he went over everyone, and nobody's missing. Often he reckons in the dawn them up, nobody is ever missing. What even this erratic rhyme scheme shows us is an erratic logic in the poem, and maybe the connections between concepts like blind and mind, objects and stanzas. On a glance, this rhyme scheme shows me that there is a strong connection between the first 2 stanzas, but there is only one line in the last stanza that rhymes with any line in the first 2. This might suggest a change in perspective, psychological state, or character resolve. This is another way to approach a poem for analysis. Here are a couple things to look for when identifying some of these more popular forms. But there is more to the form than a couple guidelines. There are often centuries of traditions and poetic aesthetics that have changed throughout the years. For example, sonnets have over 500 years of history, with hundreds of sonnet writers or sonneteers playing with the forms and traditions in all that time. Shakespeare invented his own take on the sonnet. So did Spenser. So did Hopkins. The sonnet is probably still the most popular poetic form, but it originated not as a way of writing in a high art form, but as a way of wooing women, often women who were married or unavailable. They tended to extol the virtues of the author's beloved by comparing her to the beauty of nature and heaven. The rhyme scheme is the best way to determine the type of sonnet it is. However, many contemporary sonneteers create their own rhyme scheme. Many great and famous poets have taken their shot at the sonnet. Try looking at a couple and see how they approach such a long tradition with a fresh perspective. Look, it matters. The traditional theme of a sonnet is love, but many sonnets also examine obsessions and deep spiritual connections or problems. All the things that are at the heart of our concepts of love. Or how a poem challenges our concepts of what love is. What might a sonnet about God suggest? What about a sonnet about nature? Or one about James Brown, the godfather of soul? Poet Terence Hayes wrote a sonnet about Mr. T. It's pretty good. Most writers of sonnets know the traditions, even if they broke them. Remember, they have their reasons. Blank verse and especially free verse are the forms that are most common in contemporary poetry. It may not seem like this because most English teachers focus mostly on old poems that mostly rhyme and mostly adhere to some sort of rhyme scheme and use words like thy and thou and thee. Not so with contemporary poems. One thing to remember, however, when writing about poetic forms. If there is no discernible form, or you have nothing to say about that form, you don't need to belabor the point, and you shouldn't even bring it up in your paper if you're not going to be willing to discuss it. there are countless other things to look for in a poem. With blank verse, the meter and sense of line are the determining factors. Blank verse poems tend to be iambic pentameter, the same meter as a sonnet. The stanzas are often long or non-existent, and an important distinction of blank verse is that it has no regular rhyme scheme. Blank verse poems tend to be long. Think Shakespeare plays. Think Paradise Lost. Big poems. Free verse, on the other hand, is often considered a poem that has no formal requirements. Poets who practice free verse may still utilize sound and rhythm. They may be lyric poems, but they organize their poems in other ways, by images, by fragmented narrative, or by countless other ways a poet might consider their sense of line. There are countless poems that play with form to reinforce or subvert content. There are even poems that use shape to reflect content in various ways. This is fine because poetry in many ways is a visual art form. All the white space and the length of the line is part of the experience of the poem. Most poetic forms have long traditions that many contemporary poets take great joy in distorting for personal and poetical reasons. And remember, poets who write poems worth analyzing always have their reasons. Consider this grouping of words on the left. It has shape and considers line and visual aspects of the work. But what keeps it from being a worthwhile poem? Aside from 20 obvious things, the form of the poem has nothing to do with its content. You should get the feeling that the only consideration for the poetic line was to make it fit the shape of a heart, because that is exactly what I did. There better be better reasons for such a dramatic choice in a poem. Now that we have gone over some of the fundamental building blocks of a poem, you should be able to understand the effects of subtle choices an author makes in regards to line and stanza. We have also gone over some of the basics of a few important poetic forms. Remember, each form has a long tradition that has changed throughout the decades and centuries. Now that you know some of the basics, get out your metaphorical microscope and see what makes these poems tick.